Hey, you found your way back to Subversive Preacher. My name is Cameron Miller. I'm excited to share with you that www.subversivepreacher.org is undergoing a significant renovation as I am retiring from parish ministry and focusing on my writing and production ministries. Sermons will be replaced by a podcast, and while my weekly newspaper column, Denim Spirit, continues, I will be adding a weekly blog as well. I will be adding also contemplative videos and some surprises, I'm sure, along the way. But no worries, the sermons and the columns are in archives and available to you as we go along. You can find me via Subversive Preacher or www.cameronmiller.org as well. If this space has resonated with you in the past, I hope you will find it even more resonant in the future. Now, a sermon for Lent. Today we have Abram and Sarah, the prophets, and Jesus. Let's think about these characters. I'm thinking that the biblical characters, all the biblical characters that come at us week to week, are like those cheap China creche figures, all dusty from unuse. We unwrap them once a year and look at them and smile or chuckle at the memories that we associate with them, but they have no real character or meaning of their own, only our memories of Christmases past that we imbue them with. But those poor biblical figures, like Abram and Sarah, don't even have any little decorative figures or holidays, at least in Christianity, to bring out every year. So for us, in a church that listens to the Bible but doesn't memorize it like some traditions do, nor uses it as a rule book, nor believes it literally, a lot of biblical characters are just names. But really, when we stop to think about it and see them with fresh eyes, these are some crazy stories we tell each other. I mean, really, if they were all actual, factual, really did happen exactly that way kind of stories, I dare say no one in their right mind would want to be associated with the God behind the curtain of those stories. I mean, here's what I mean. There's the patriarch and matriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Abram and Sarah, who are sent on an endless errand without knowing the destination or really even having a purpose for it. And 3 generations later, their great-great-great-grandson Joseph gets traded into slavery by his brothers for a purpose that wasn't revealed for decades. Then, when the world of humanity, of human history and allegiances had changed unrecognizably, Moses gets sent to Egypt, where it is often forgotten by us that he was a wanted fugitive because he murdered a soldier. And later, as the story of that people unfolds, a woman named Ruth pulls up stakes and leaves everything she knows to be a stranger in a strange land simply out of devotion. Still more centuries later, a migrant worker named Amos gets plucked up from an orchard where he was working and put down in the king's sanctuary, and the poor blighter is given a task of telling the king and all the elites around the king that they are about to be crushed because of their iniquities. And let's not forget the guy Jeremiah, who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but is given the job of prophet, only to be thrown down in a well he can't get out of because the king and everyone else in power can't stand to listen to him anymore. And all these stories makes the one about the illiterate peasant turned preacher who was pushed out of his nest in rural Galilee and sent to the big city in Jerusalem not seem so unusual by biblical standards. I mean, that poor prophet named Jesus knew that King Herod, who beheaded John the Baptist, was in Jerusalem. And he also knew the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, who once lined a 20-mile stretch of road from Jerusalem to Jericho with crucified rebels just to make a point. That guy was in Jerusalem too. So we see story after story in the Bible about someone or group of someone's sent someplace to do something. And what they're sent to do is so often hazardous and almost always without knowing the purpose or the outcome. Whew. Who in their right mind thinks that's a good idea? Or more to the point, what's with the God who is behind all that struggle and grief and sorrow? Again, the way we read these stories, through no fault of our own really, is out of context and isolated from what was going on all around the main characters. It's like one poplar or birch tree left standing after all the others around it have been harvested. We see the tree without the forest within which it grew up. It's no wonder these names from the past are at best stick figures and at worst totally unknown. So this little story from Luke caused me to want to try to bring it to life by pulling up some of the notable people who actually did populate the culture and the day-to-day conversations of people around Jesus, of Jesus himself. I'm sure I've told you about some of these characters, if not all of them, because they influenced the world of Jesus that he grew up in. We've heard about the Caesars and the kings ruling that part of the world in and around Jesus' time. But what about his peers? What about people rising up out of Jesus' social class to become famous in Judah and Galilee? So let's review some of those colorful people. In the 50 years on either side of Jesus, there were actually many messiahs and prophets aplenty. Jesus would have grown up knowing the names I'm going to mention and the stories told about these prophets and messiahs. He would have heard family and friends cheer them or jeer them, depending on whether they lived in fear of their rebellions and what they might bring down on their village, or hope that they would succeed in destroying the tyrants that made their lives miserable. We only have vague knowledge of them via specific historical records about their deeds, but of course most of it is told from the winner's side of things. We know about zealots, for example, because they are featured in the stories of Jesus. But their original founder was named Ezekiel, or maybe Hezekiah, it isn't quite clear. We don't know exactly what happened to the zealots, but we do know that Ezekiel led what we would call a guerrilla war 50 years before Jesus was born. He was beheaded without a trial, and his followers were rounded up and killed. And then his son, the son of Ezekiel, named Judas, but no relationship to the disciple Judas, raised an army and attacked Herod's palace in Sepphoris, stole all the weapons stored there and a whole bunch of rich people plunder, and then he disappeared from history. Really, without a trace. Maybe he was arrested, we don't know, but I like to think that he ended up on some island in Greece on the beach. Not long before Jesus was born, Simon of Perea, which was the same place John the Baptist came from, was a slave in Herod the Great's palace. And after Herod the Great died, and just before that first Christmas, Simon gathered an army and went on a bloody campaign, attacking almost all of Herod's many palaces. He even burned down the big one in Jericho. But his army was defeated, and he was chased down and beheaded. Now, my favorite one is Atheron's, the shepherd, called the shepherd, who was described as taller and stronger than anyone else had seen before. But he also had 4 brothers of similar stature. He led a 2-year rebellion against Herod the Great's son and the Roman army. In fact, Jesus was born in the middle of the shepherd's rebellion. So his mom and dad and uncles and aunts and cousins would all have talked about it for years. Now the big guy's army was finally put down, and while his brothers were captured, no one knows what happened to Athron's. Another Greek island, maybe? Finally, there was Judas the Galilean. Again, no relationship to the disciple with the same name. He led a rebellion against the census we know about from Jesus' birth narrative, except that the actual census came several years after Jesus was born. Now, Judas's rebellion failed, obviously, and Judas the Galilean was killed. Several of his sons were the leaders and the messiahs in the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70 that led to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the genocide of Jews in Judah and Galilee. It was his grandson, I think, who led the famous stand on top of Masada against the Romans. So Ezekias and Judas, son of Ezekias, Simon of Perea, Anthron the shepherd, Judas the Galilean, and of course John the Baptist, all of them Hall of Famers at the millennium. Those are the names of famous prophets and messiahs, and Jesus could have rattled off all their names with the same familiarity that you and I can talk about Hollywood stars. I'm guessing that when Jesus wept over Jerusalem, and it said, as it did today in today's gospel, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and stone to death those who are sent to you, that he was thinking about characters like Anthron the shepherd and Judas the Galilean. It was a time in which people felt their hopes smashed against the rocks, and petty autocrats and natural disasters destroying hope. And then they would stand up and try again to bring the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. They would feel the presence of a faraway, violent empire that sought to control the people and lands at their farthest edge of the map. Again and again, violence and injustice, not to mention famine and drought, brought people to their knees in grief for those around them who had already died, in fear for themselves. Still they huddled and they struggled, and they found ways to rebuild and to resist and carve a space for themselves and for those they loved. What powered them? What powered them was deep connection. Connection to one another and connection to the long history and traditions of their spiritual community. In refusing to allow those in power to isolate them, they stayed connected to one another. And they remembered who they were and whose they were. They did not ever get to know how their story ended, because it's a story that's still being lived out and told today. But because they held on to one another and they held on to their spiritual tradition, we have this place with one another today. They are here now with us, and so are some of their traditions. The kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. We've been working on it for a very long time, and obviously there's more to do. Thanks for being here. Peace be with you.